Welcome to the session of the John Whitmer Historical Association, our 50th anniversary. You'll see a few people dressed up in their 70s attire. I wore my Star Trek mask to recall those days of Star Trek. And anyway, we're so happy you're here. Thank you. Encourage you at this time, if you would, please silence your cell phones and we also encourage you as much as possible to wear masks. That allows our presenters to unmask safely, and we do appreciate the community of Christ and other Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for their willingness to be safe. So this session is being recorded, and it's session 212, and it's my great delight and honor to introduce our speakers today. I've been asked to substitute for Mel Johnson, who is unable to join us today, so if you see that name, I'm Devin Jensen. I'm the executive editor at the Brigham Young University Religious Studies Center. So our first speaker, Newell Bringhurst, is an American historian and author of books and essays. Most of his writings have been about Mormonism, particularly topics and figures of controversy, such as blacks and the priesthood, Fawn Brody, polygamy, and schisms within the Latter-day Saint movement. So, hold on, buckle in, you're ready for a ride. Newell taught history and political science for 35 years at the College of the Sequoias in Visalia, California, and is now professor emeritus. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and start in the presentation here, and I'll introduce our second speaker in a moment here as well. And we'll watch how things are going. Because this is Zoom, we're also going to be doing this live stream. And then at the end, we'll probably have about 20 minutes or so for questions and answers. So I'd encourage you to be thinking about questions you want to ask these two gentlemen, and then address them, the person you're thinking of, particularly if you have one for both, maybe just note that. And then we'll have our speakers repeat the question for those at home. Okay, our second speaker, Matt Harris. So, wonderful professor of history and director of legal studies at Colorado State University, Pueblo. And I'm excited to tell you he has a book manuscript with Oxford that has passed. It looks like it's going to pass review, titled Black Saints, Modern Mormonism's Struggle with Racism. And he said to tell you that he is proud of his alma mater, Brigham Young University, which makes me very happy. And it's kind of ironic because I'm wearing red today, right? Anyway, thank you, Matt, for presenting. So first, Professor Bringhurst. Welcome. Thank you.
Well, it gives me great pleasure to just at the beginning to say that after about a 5-year hiatus, I hadn't attended John Whitmer for some 5 years because of a family conflict. Our oldest grandson always has his birthday right around the same time as John Whitmer, and that's why I have been absent. I've thought fondly of all of the experiences that I've had. My first John Whitmer was back some 44 years ago, when it was still a youthful organization, and so this is kind of like a great reunion, and seeing a lot of new familiar faces that I haven't seen for a number of years. So this is a great reunion. Reunion is a big thing in the community of Christ, and so I consider this my reunion to return to independence. And anyway, Eldridge Cleaver, the one-time Black Panther, and Cleon Skousen, former FBI agent and noted conservative activist, were most unlikely allies during the early 1980s. Indeed, I have dubbed them Mormonism's original odd couple, although that title has been affixed to myself and my good friend Craig Foster out there. So, as I say it, things come around. Physically, they were polar opposites. 45-year-old Eldridge Cleaver had a commanding presence. His towering 6'3" frame, trimmed with his afro hairdo, and his intimidating Van Dyke beard enhanced his assertive style of speaking. Whereas Skousen, in his late 60s, projected Is that working?
Yeah, it's working now.
Are we okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Projected a laid-back demeanor. He was short, bald, slight in stature, bespectacled, and soft-spoken. Features that obscured his strongly held right-wing convictions. The pair, moreover, came from vastly different backgrounds. Leroy Eldridge Cleaver was born in Wabasaka, Arkansas in 1935. Despite being brought up Baptist by his devoutly religious mother, he engaged in habitual criminal behavior following the family's move to Los Angeles. At the age of 14, he was arrested for stealing bicycles, resulting in a 3-year term in a reform school, immediately followed thereafter by 2.5-year prison term for selling marijuana. Cleaver next turned to violent criminal behavior, rape and assault with intent to commit murder, resulting in an 8-year prison term. During his period of incarceration, Cleaver completed high school and further educated himself, consuming the works of a wide range of authors, including Thomas Paine, Voltaire, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Karl Marx. The latter individual inspired him to embrace Marxist-Leninism. He also completed the manuscript for his seminal work, Soul on Ice. Following his release from prison in 1966, Cleaver joined the militant Black Panther Party, becoming its firebrand Minister of Information. In November 1968, Cleaver fled the country in the wake of a shootout with Oakland police. Over the following 8 years, Cleaver lived in exile, initially in Cuba, then Algeria, and finally France. He was joined by his wife Kathleen, whom he married in 1967. However, Cleaver's direct exposure to the authoritarian regimes in Cuba and Algeria caused him to abandon his Marxist-Lenin beliefs. And following a mystical religious experience, Cleaver proclaimed himself a born-again Christian. In November 1975, Cleaver returned to the United States, surrendering to authorities to face charges related to his 1968 shootout with Oakland police. Initially incarcerated at Alameda County Jail for 8 months, he avoided further jail time through a plea bargain arrangement, agreeing to perform some 2,000 hours of community service. And doing this, he settled in nearby Cupertino, where he came in contact with the LDS Church and subsequently with W. Cleon Skousen. Skousen came from a much different background. A generation older than Cleaver, Skousen was born in 1913 into an LDS family in Raymond, Alberta, Canada. After serving an LDS mission to Great Britain, Skousen earned a Juris Doctorate degree from George Washington University Law School. In 1940, he joined the Federal Bureau of Investigation, where he served as a special agent for 11 years. Following that, he became Salt Lake City Police Chief, but his 5-year tenure proved controversial. He was fired by then-Mayor J. Bracken Lee for allegedly employing Gestapo tactics in running the city's police force, but he also was involved in a vice raid. That's the subplot there that he was engaged in some illegal gambling, and Lee was a guy that was he's a colorful figure in and of himself. I could say a lot more about him. Likewise controversial were Skousen's subsequent activities as a promoter of far-right political views, condemning the welfare state and U.S. involvement in the United Nations. His greatest concern, however, was international communism, which he dubbed an existentialist threat, plotting to dominate the entire world. Skousen initially promoted such conspiracy theories through his highly popular book, The Naked Communist. In further publicizing his views, Skousen established the Friedman Institute in 1971. Billed as a nonprofit educational foundation, the Institute conducted seminars to alert the larger public Such gatherings were held throughout the western United States and Canada. It was at a Freeman Institute event in October 1980 that Skousen and Cleaver first met. Skousen was the featured speaker at a Know Your Religion event held at the Cupertino LDS Ward Meeting House. Cleaver, not yet formally a church member, attended the gathering at the urging of Carl Lober, his close, good friend who had introduced him to the church. Upon hearing Skousen speak, Cleaver was deeply impressed. He recalled, "I was overwhelmed with the words of Dr. Skousen. From my own political background and my experiences in the communist countries, I knew he was telling the truth. I was relieved to hear so much sound thinking from an anti-communist." Cleaver continued, "Skousen was a fanatic, just like me, fighting for the gospel while struggling for freedom and America." Not surprisingly, Cleaver and Skousen developed a very close relationship, even a deep friendship, for a short period of time. In February 1981, Cleaver traveled to Utah to learn more about both the Freeman Institute and the LDS Church. At Skousen's urging, Cleaver attended a series of Freeman Institute seminars. As Cleaver later recalled, quote, "If my family had enjoyed these classes when I was growing up, I would have never been a communist. I would have learned to love America." Cleaver, as a transformed American nationalist, asserted that the Soviet Union fully intended to take control of the whole world and turn it into a communist empire. He proclaimed his newly embraced mentor, Skousen, quote, "a great teacher dedicated to saving the country." Also during his Utah visit, Cleaver met with senior LDS apostle Ezra Taft Benson, an ultra-right associate of Skousen. Cleaver also spoke to two different groups, the BYU Law School and the Freeman Century Club. Skousen, impressed with Cleaver's performance at both events, quickly enlisted him as a regular Freeman Institute speaker. Cleaver was reportedly paid some $500 for each lecture he delivered. Throughout 1981, Cleaver maintained a hectic schedule, speaking at Freeman Institute events throughout the western United States. It's interesting to note that many of the communities he spoke at were predominantly LDS communities like Snowflake and Mesa, Arizona, Idaho Falls, Rigby, Idaho. And the highlight, however, of Cleaver's 1981 Freeman Institute tour was his return to Utah by mid-June to participate in the Institute's annual Freedom Festival as its featured speaker. This was kind of the high point for him. At this event, held in BYU's Marriott Center, Cleaver held forth to an audience of nearly 12,000 people, the largest he had ever addressed. Cleaver compared communist countries to giant prisons, with dictators as wardens who commanded an army to control a captive population. Cleaver's involvement with the Freeman Institute prompted him to request immediate baptism into the church, doing so in April 1981. Encouraging him was W. Cleon Skousen. Despite Cleaver's strong desire, his actual baptism was delayed for some 3 years because LDS officials mandated that he must complete the terms of his probation and remaining 600 hours of community service. Despite the delay, Cleaver maintained a close relationship with the Latter-day Saint community in the San Jose area. When not speaking on behalf of the Freeman Institute, he attended church services on a regular basis in the San Jose 6th Ward. As he recalled, "I felt good being there, given that there was a purpose for me being there." Cleaver further strengthened his relationship with local Latter-day Saints through formation in early 1981 of his own self-styled 4th of July movement, which he dubbed his pet project. Cleaver recruited a significant number of local Latter-day Saints to assist him. Clearly modeled on the Freeman Institute as an educational institution, the 4th of July movement advocated, quote, the defense and restoration of the Constitution and the traditions of the Founding Fathers. Throughout the rest of 1981, Cleaver resumed his hectic schedule as a Freeman Institute speaker, traveling throughout the American West and into Canada. And over the following 2 years, from 1982 into 1983, Cleaver continued to present lectures on behalf of the Freeman Institute. Finally, in December 1983, Cleaver was formally baptized a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, having fulfilled the terms of his probation. The ordinance took place in the Oakland Interstate Center with Cleaver's good friend Carl Lober performing the actual baptism. Conspicuously absent, however, from this well-attended ceremony was Cleaver's wife, Kathleen, who showed no interest whatsoever in the church, despite Eldridge's repeated efforts to get her to join. Kathleen, in fact, had left Eldridge some 2 years earlier to attend Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. Also absent, for reasons less clear, was Cleon Skousen. Despite achieving his long-sought goal of church membership, Cleaver's active involvement quickly waned. Initially, as a member of the Oakland First Ward, Cleaver attended episodically, according to then Bishop Dean Criddle. Cleaver's involvement further declined following his move from Oakland to Berkeley in 1985. It was sporadic, recalls Berkeley Ward Bishop Robert Gamblin, with Cleaver keeping pretty much to himself when he was in attendance. Cleaver's involvement ended completely by the time that Stephen Ferguson succeeded Gamblin as Bishop of the Berkeley Ward. The obvious question is, what prompted Cleaver's withdrawal from church activity, particularly given that he was so anxious to become a Latter-day Saint? I think there's 3 basic factors. One of the most important were residual effects from Eldridge's separation and ultimate divorce from his wife, Kathleen, which was finalized in 1985. Particularly difficult was losing primary custody of his son and daughter, who remained with their mother. His marital difficulties notwithstanding, Cleaver had been a caring, committed parent, as recalled by his son, Amon Marcial. The second cause of Cleaver's lapse into activity was his change of residence from San Jose to Oakland and ultimately to Berkeley, leaving behind a close circle of Latter-day Saints with whom he had interacted and befriended when he was living in San Jose. By contrast, he was unwilling or unable to cultivate a similar level of interaction with his fellow Mormons in his new environment. Sensing the hazards of Cleaver's move to the Bay Area, Skousen urged him to relocate instead to Salt Lake City, which would place him closer to both the church and the headquarters of the Freeman Institute. But Cleaver refused to move. Worse still, Skousen was forced to dismiss Cleaver as a Freeman Institute speaker due to his repeated efforts to show up at events at which he was scheduled to speak. A third important factor for his lapse into inactivity was his involvement in local and state politics. In early 1984, Cleaver announced his candidacy for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives as an independent in opposition to incumbent Democrat Ronald Dellums. Cleaver lambasted Dellums as, quote, a pliable tool in the hands of the Marxist-Leninist puppet masters and a third world worshipper. But the lively contest between the two African Americans ended prematurely in August 1984 with Cleaver's sudden withdrawal, opting instead to run for a seat on the Berkeley City Council. Cleaver who vigorously campaigned as an arch conservative, which is a dumb thing running for an office in Berkeley, finished dead last in a field of 14 candidates. Undaunted, Cleaver made one last bid for political office. In 1986, he sought the Republican nomination for a U.S. Senate seat. Cleaver managed to temporarily capture the limelight with his witty one-liners, characterized himself as a leader with a proven track record and a Ronald Reagan Black Panther. In the actual contest, Cleaver fell far short, finishing 8th in a crowded field of 12 candidates. In all 3 contests, Cleaver deliberately avoided making any reference to his LDS church membership. Moreover, following his abortive quest for a seat in the House of Representatives, he accused his 2 campaign managers, both Mormons, of stealing some $350,000 in campaign contributions. He bitterly lamented that neither the government nor the LDS Church disciplined the men for their actions. This, in turn, further alienated him from the church. In the wake of failure in the political arena, Cleaver became more erratic and unpredictable in his behavior and action, pushing him to even further away from the church. Such behavior stemmed in large part from the fact that he struggled financially. He sought publication of a series of essays and poems that he wrote during this period, albeit unsuccessfully. He made and sold handcrafted flower pots and sculptures, and collected and sold recycled cans and bottles collected off the streets of Berkeley. All such endeavors provided minimal, limited income. Responding to his continual series of disappointments, personal, political, and financial, Cleaver then sought solace in drugs, specifically crack cocaine. Cleaver's addiction precipitated yet a further decline in his fortunes. In October 1987, and again in June of 1992, he was arrested on charges involving the possession of crack cocaine. More serious, in March of 1994, he was attacked and nearly killed in a crack deal gone bad, after which he went through, nearly died. And he went through a lengthy period of recuperation. Cleaver's withdrawal from all LDS church activity notwithstanding, the former Black Panther expressed continuing ambivalence. He remained an LDS church member of record right up until the time of his death in June 1998. Cleaver's commitment to the church was ambivalent and non-traditional in that he wanted to be a Mormon but didn't want to make the commitment to go to church on a regular basis. I'm quoting his good friend Carl Lilburg, who had converted him to the church. As late as 1988, Cleaver characterized himself, quote, a devout Mormon, in an interview with Ebony magazine, praising the church for its adherence to the gospel and very positive program for human beings. Yet going on to state, that black people were not traditionally Mormons was very obvious to me. Some 7 years later, in 1995, he confessed that although he was no longer active in the church, he remained a supporter, adding, I am powerfully impressed with the message of the church. They do a very good job of taking care of their people, but I wish they would allow women to have a more equitable role. Cleaver's continuing ambivalence toward the church notwithstanding, his one-time close association with Cleon Skousen had long since ended. By the mid-1990s, Cleaver had abandoned the hard right views previously promoted as a Skousen protege. Instead, Cleaver proclaimed himself a religious radical, stating, "I still believe in the things I believed in the 60s, the right of the people to control the government and to be secure in their persons and not be brutalized by cops," unquote. He, moreover, relished his role in skewing the establishment, prompting him to strongly condemn the Republican Party, specifically the GOP-controlled House of Representatives, which he characterized as, quote, misogynistic, racist, and full of evil and corruption. He singled out House Speaker Newt Gingrich for special condemnation, calling him a gargoyle. But he did not spare incumbent President Bill Clinton from criticism, comparing him to, quote, a guy getting into a 747 aircraft, taking off, and then trying to figure out how to fly the thing. Meanwhile, Cleon Skousen continued to promote his conservative, hard right views, up to at the time of his death in January 2006. Skousen, dismayed by Cleaver's shifting views, claimed that his one-time protege had lost his grip on reality and lamenting that he had collapsed both mentally and physically. In conclusion, both Eldridge Cleaver and W. Cleon Skousen were noteworthy in each for their impact on the LDS Church and the larger world beyond. W. Cleon Skousen, a prolific writer, authored some 46 books. Among his best-selling, The Naked Communist, The Making of America, and The 5,000-Year Leap. His books on religion reached millions of readers, not just among the LDS, among Latter-day Saints, but also individuals in the larger Christian and Jewish community as well. Various of Skousen's right-wing concepts have been embraced by later conservatives, right down to the present, most notably media personality Glenn Beck and longtime Republican United States Senator Orrin Hatch. Likewise, Eldridge Cleaver left a lasting influence both within the Latter-day Saint community and beyond. As the most prominent African American to join the LDS Church in the immediate aftermath of the 1978 revelation, his conversion generated publicity throughout the United States and beyond. Also, Cleaver's transformation from a left-wing Marxist revolutionary into a conservative, born-again Christian was endemic of larger trends of American society at large. However, Cleaver's most noteworthy remembrance is for his searing memoir, Soul on Ice. In the words of contemporary African-American author Abram X. Kendi, Cleaver was, quote, a giant of a man and thinker and writer whose Soul on Ice served as the manifesto of Black power masculinity. Thank you.
I'm still struggling over one of Newell's concluding remarks that Cleon Skousen, a man who never met a conspiracy theory he didn't like or embrace, told Cleaver that he was worried about him being unmoored politically. So I'm still thinking about this. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here today. I just finished a massive book, as Devin said, on blacks in the Mormon Church that mostly focuses on the 20th and 21st centuries. So I've been thinking about race and civil rights for a long time now. And recently, in I guess August, just not too long ago, when I started putting this paper together, I realized that I needed more material from the RLDS tradition. And so I want to just pay a special tribute to Rachel Killebrew, if I said her last name correctly, the inimitable Community of Christ archivist, who sent me thousands of pages of material in PDF form that made me almost miss one of my classes. I was so intrigued reading the RLDS First Presidency's thoughts on race, and also my friend Bill Russell, who sadly couldn't be with us today. He's in a concurrent session, so that means I can say whatever I want to say about him today. And no, I'm just teasing. But he did, some of my paper today, as you'll hear, is about him and his amazing experiences in the 60s. And I had the benefit of his penetrating insights in my work, and I'm really grateful for that. In 1998, after years of living among the Mormons in Utah, RLDS apostle Russell F. Ralston added a 4-page addendum to a provocative book he published in 1960. In Fundamental Differences Between the Reorganized Church and the Church in Utah, Ralston explained the differences between the two churches relative to race. He proclaimed that his church was more progressive, and as evidence, he cited that RLDS leaders had ordained black men to the priesthood since 1865, while the LDS Church didn't ordain them until 1978. Ralston certainly pulled his punches. He studiously avoided mentioning Joseph Smith III's revelation in Doctrine and Covenants 1:16, verse 4, when he warned the church not to be hasty in ordaining men of the Negro race to offices in my church. And he claimed, because not all were acceptable unto me as servants, is how the verse reads. Nor did Ralston mention that a number of RLDS members also believed that black people bore a divine curse, which was a long-held belief by the Mormons. And finally, he didn't acknowledge that there were negligible differences in civil rights between the two churches. Both governing hierarchies refused to support Martin Luther King, and both had members steeped in right-wing extremism that shaped how the respective churches responded to the civil rights movement. So today I want to highlight how both Restoration churches developed a moderate position on civil rights, despite many members and leaders opposing the civil rights movement. I also want to highlight how both churches responded to Martin Luther King's death, which fundamentally changed how they viewed racial equality. 1963 was a critical time for both the RLDS and LDS churches. That year, as lawmakers debated the civil rights bill in Congress, racial protests exploded across the country. An enterprising and energetic Baptist minister named Martin Luther King led numerous demonstrations throughout the South, and his counterpart, Malcolm X, gave fiery speeches throughout the North, in which he drew attention to the nation's gross injustices of economic inequality and urban poverty. Tension escalated that spring when millions of Americans watched in horror as Alabama Governor Eugene Bull O'Connor unleashed police dogs and fire hoses on black Americans, including children and pregnant women, who protested segregated restaurants and recreational facilities in Birmingham. Then in August, Dr. King gave a rousing speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., before 250,000 people, in which he called for a nation to rid itself of the quicksands of racial injustice and embrace the solid rock of brotherhood. A month later in September, only weeks after King's I Have a Dream speech, the Klan murdered 4 black girls and injured 20 other black congregants when they bombed a Baptist church in Birmingham, Alabama. With the nation spiraling into chaos, the RLDS and LDS churches, like so many other Christian churches, broke their silence and responded. The RLDS church was first confronted with Dr. King's legacy in August of 1963, when RLDS activist and NAACP member William Russell, the assistant editor of the church's magazine, Saints Herald, published a provocative editorial within its pages called Martin Luther King, Satan or Saint. Russell wanted to counter the malicious allegations emerging in the nation's newspapers, alleging that Martin Luther King was a communist, which right-wing extremists had asserted for years with reckless abandon. Ever since the Great Depression, communism had attracted a number of prominent African-American intellectuals, artists, and poets, including Langston Hughes, W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, Ralph Ellison, and Richard Wright, and right-wing extremists had used their affiliation with the Communist Party to stain the entire civil rights movement as communist-inspired. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover and John Birch Society founder Robert Welsh were the biggest purveyors of this falsehood. They'd indoctrinated millions of gullible Christians who bought into their outlandish claims without ever critically appraising them. Thus it fell to William Russell, who helped to edit the church's most prominent magazine, to refute the charges within the reorganized church. His editorial took an edgy tone. He told his audience that King wasn't a communist, but was a good Christian man. Any American who agitates for social change is likely to be called a communist, Russell wrote. then added with a dose of typical Bill Russell wit, "If Jesus Christ with his radical social views was living in America today, we do not know how well he would be received, but certainly some would call him a communist." If you know Bill, that's just something that Bill would say. As for the notion that King was pushing too fast, a common complaint among birchers and racist Southerners, and even moderates, Russell dismissed that idea in quick fashion too. America is fortunate that it has pushed as fast as he has. America is fortunate that King has pushed as fast as he has. Were there not a prophetic voice speaking out for nonviolent resistance to racial discrimination, the most likely alternative would be violence. Russell concluded his editorial calling for the RLDS saints to be active in the cause. "Let us not remain silent on this issue," he wrote, "for to do so is to make the gospel irrelevant to today's needs." It didn't take long for Russell to kick over a hornet's nest. Within days of publishing his editorial, numerous RLDS members complained to the governing First Presidency. They weren't used to controversial statements like Russell's because the editorials the church had published in the past on race were innocuous and largely non-controversial. Most stressed the universal nature of brotherhood and God's love for all races. Now the church's conservative members had an editorial before them that challenged their political sensibilities, and they didn't like it. One letter writer, typical of the complaints, charged Dr. King with being a dupe for the communists and groused that Dr. King presided over a culture of lawlessness and violence. This is a letter that a member had written to the First Presidency. Other RLDS members complained directly to Russell. One member accused Russell of being subjected to a communist brainwashing and was sure that communists had gotten the best of him just as they had Dr. King. Other protesters tried to convince Russell of the errancy of his position by sending him right-wing literature. In addition, they peppered their letters with quotes from people affiliated with the extremist John Birch Society and the White Citizens Council, which Russell brushed off with characteristic elan. To one interrogator, he said, "We have received dozens of letters as yours, maintaining that the integration movement is communist-led or inspired." Then Russell went on to chide the woman, telling her that our treatment of minority groups in America is horrible blasphemy against God. The RLDS First Presidency, which was comprised of President W. Wallace Smith and his counselors, Henry Edwards and Maurice Draper, they didn't want to jump into this briar patch. But the sheer number of complaints about Russell's article forced their hand. Not wanting to offend their liberal or conservative members, they took a moderate position, neither affirming support for civil rights nor criticizing the movement and its leaders. Their middle-of-the-road approach was most evident in an editorial they published in the Saints Herald in August of 1963, exactly a couple of months after Russell's pro-King editorial. Here the First Presidency articulated the church's position on race and color by carefully avoiding the discussion of King or his supporters. Instead, they reminded members that the gospel is for all mankind and added that it knows of no distinction or color. But it wasn't a completely tepid statement. The First Presidency tilted their hats toward the church's liberal members when they said that their Negro members could join the NAACP to fight for racial justice, which drew a mild rejoinder from Russell, who wanted the First Presidency to clarify the statement. And this is what Bill said. "I'm wondering if readers might get the impression that you do not approve of white members belonging to the NAACP. So that was kind of a perception. It was Negro members, but not white members. Other members also expressed discontent with the First Presidency statement. One member asked the First Presidency point blank, "What is the official church policy regarding the civil rights movement for the Negro?" Which put the First Presidency on the spot to flesh out more carefully their position in the editorial they had published in the Saints Herald. But rather than answer the man's question, the First Presidency cleverly avoided it and reaffirmed the church's past statements on race. 2 years later, members continued to bombard the governing hierarchy with questions about where the church stood in relation to the civil rights movement. The First Presidency told a concerned member, quote, "We do not want or intend for our periodicals to imply that the church is committed to the civil rights movement, or for that matter, to any similar movement." To another church member, they were even more direct. "The church has not approved the civil rights movement headed by Dr. Martin Luther King." I might just pause for a moment. Here you have Bill Russell writing these, pro-civil rights and pro-Dr. King editorials. Then you've got the First Presidency saying this in private, that we don't really sanction this. But yet it's being published in the official church magazine. So there is a little bit of a chasm going on here. In the meantime, as the First Presidency grew frustrated with the number of critical letters coming in, they told Paula Wellington, the editor of the Saints Herald, and the assistant editor, Bill Russell, to tone it down. Between 1956 and 1970, RLDS magazines and periodicals had published 85 articles on issues relating to civil rights, race, and racial equality, with the majority of them published in the critical years of the 1960s. The First Presidency instructed them to publish fewer articles on, quote, controversial subjects, because they didn't like the disproportionate emphasis placed on civil rights. And clearly, of course, they're sensitive to not wanting to offend their ultra-conservative members. If the RLDS position on civil rights was driven mostly by member complaints, the LDS Church's response to the civil rights movement, which also leaned moderate, was motivated by a threat from the NAACP. In the spring of 1963, NAACP leaders grew impatient with LDS leaders for refusing to support two civil rights bills that were then up for debate in the Utah State Legislature. They were both anti-discrimination bills. One was on housing and the other one was in jobs. And the bills, if they passed, they would have prevented employers or renters from discriminating on the basis of race. In any event, that impatience led them to protest the NAACP at the church's October General Conference, or at least threaten to. The LDS First Presidency, comprised of President David O. McKay, his first counselor Hubie Brown, and his second counselor Eldon Tanner, they preferred to remain silent on both bills, which angered the state's small but vocal black population. The First Presidency said that civil rights legislation is not a moral question and therefore not a church matter. The NAACP's demand that the Mormon Church leadership support the two pending bills put the governing hierarchy in a difficult position because they didn't want to comment on civil rights issues. There were a number of reasons for this. First, unlike the RLDS Church, which had no official stand on the subject, LDS leaders opposed interracial marriage. One LDS leader even called it, quote, a wicked virus. The LDS Church leadership viewed segregation as the last line of defense against interracial marriage, and thus they rejected civil rights protections to integrate public facilities. And I might add that the LDS tradition, they're not much different from where a lot of people stand in the 1960s on interracial marriage, according to public opinion polls. So this is not unique for the Mormon Church leadership to take this view against interracial marriage in the 60s. Second, they didn't want to call attention to what is commonly called the priesthood and temple ban, which restricted people of African descent from full participation in the church, a prohibition that had been in place since 1852. Third, many Latter-day Saints were swept up in right-wing extremism like their RLDS cousins, and many viewed Dr. King as subversive and corrupt. Whereas RLDS Church President Wallace Smith believed that King was a communist and shared a deep skepticism of the entire civil rights movement, he kept his views largely to himself. But that was not the case with LDS apostle and future church president Ezra Taft Benson. He claimed repeatedly in public and private that Dr. King was a communist, and he embraced a number of conspiracy theories that he derived from his affiliation with the John Birch Society, the most extreme anti-communist organization in the United States. Just pause for a quick second, one of the biggest conspiracy theories that Birch promoted that would ultimately really damage their reputation was that Dwight Eisenhower, a five-star general turned president, was a communist dupe, and which is an extraordinary claim because Mormon Apostle Benson had served in Eisenhower's cabinet for 8 years and had bought into this nonsense that his former boss was a communist. And needless to say, it would ultimately damage their relationship. As the fall conference approached, the LDS First Presidency faced a dilemma. They could produce a pro-civil rights statement and run the risk of alienating their ultra-conservative members, or they could ignore the NAACP and incur their wrath. The First Presidency chose to produce a statement. The man who nudged them in this direction was liberal First Presidency counselor Hubie Brown, who shared many of the same beliefs regarding the civil rights movement as Bill Russell. Neither man believed that King was a communist, and both believed that right-wing extremism had harmed their respective churches. Toward that end, Brown was worried that the NAACP would disrupt the fall conference, so he convinced the NAACP to call off the march when he secured Church President David O. McKay's approval for him to endorse the civil rights statement at the October 1963 General Conference. During the opening moments of the conference, Brown read a short statement before he delivered his sermon. "We would like it to be known," he said, "that there is in this church no doctrine, belief, or practice that is intended to deny the enjoyment of full civil rights by any person regardless of race, color, or creed." Brown then concluded, "For all people to commit themselves to the establishment of full civil equality for all of God's children." To most outside observers, Brown's statement might seem unremarkable and perhaps even punchless because it didn't endorse specific civil rights bills. But to Latter-day Saints, Brown's statement marked a watershed moment because it was the first time the LDS First Presidency had ever said anything publicly about black people or anything positive about civil rights. To be sure, this was a gutsy statement in that it contradicted Apostle Ezra Taft Benson's pointed attacks on the civil rights movement, which the church had published frequently in its magazines and presses. Recognizing that his statement clashed with Apostle Benson's, Hugh B. Brown braggingly reported that his views on civil rights, not Benson's, constituted the official church position. A little bit of a swagger there. The two men were at odds. They were not close, to put it mildly. But clearly there were limitations with Brown's statement beyond his failure to endorse a specific civil rights bill. Much like the RLDS First Presidency's editorial in 1963, Brown conspicuously avoided mentioning Dr. King. He had all he could do to get President McKay to allow him to make a statement in the first place without stoking controversy by invoking the civil rights leader. There were too many right-wing extremists in the church who believed that the civil rights movement was, quote, part of the pattern for the communist takeover of America. That's a quote from Elder Benson. And so Hugh Brown had to tread cautiously. Moreover, a number of Latter-day Saints had joined the John Birch Society with the encouragement of Elder Benson, the apostle, and his friend W. Cleon Skousen, both of whom convinced tens of thousands of Latter-day Saints to view Dr. King in the most negative light possible. In that context, Brown's statement endorsing civil rights was a risky move because it offended Brown's followers and caused them to question their leaders. These disgruntled members called Brown a Judas and a variety of other unsavory names. Reed Benson, the apostle's outspoken son, sneered that Brown was, quote, a rabid, frothing-at-the-mouth Democrat. I'm not sure what that means, rabid, frothing at the mouth. I think of some sick animal, that ate something bad. Yeah, I guess it's not a compliment. Coming from Reed Benson, maybe it is. Anyway, a controversial character in history for sure, Reed Benson. Anyway, so he called this church leader, Hugh B. Brown, a rabid, frothing-at-the-mouth Democrat who supported Martin Luther King, the country's most notorious traitor. And he said this in a public meeting at a state conference, an LDS Church state conference. That's what he said about it. So, kind of a controversial person. In the meantime, Apostle Benson had harsh things to say about his liberal colleague as well. He called Brown a socialist in a sharply worded letter to him and said that he had been deceived by, quote, the insidious, satanical, socialist, communist conspiracy. At about the same time that Apostle Benson and his followers were slinging mud at Brown, the NAACP threatened another protest when they told the LDS First Presidency that they would march at church headquarters in the spring of 1965. They were still angry that the church didn't support anti-discrimination bills in housing and employment, and they made their voices heard. According to NAACP leader Johnny Driver, much of the difficulty which Negroes face in gaining access to decent housing and securing adequate employment in Utah exists because of the official LDS Church doctrine of exclusion of Negroes from the priesthood. And then Driver concluded, LDS Church leaders should speak out for moral justice. The NAACP made good on their word. Over a 3-day period in March of 1965, dozens of protesters marched while Associated Press reporters broadcasted the NAACP's grievances against the LDS Church in their nation's newspapers. But that was only the beginning. In July of 1965, the NAACP leadership passed a unanimous resolution asking government leaders in South America, Asia, Africa, to refuse to grant visas to Mormon missionaries and representatives of the LDS Church until the church changed its doctrine of non-white superiority and produced a positive statement of civil rights. That, too, drew plenty of widespread newspaper coverage. Meanwhile, as the LDS Church leadership watched these developments unfold in the presses, they decided to capitalize on the moment by informing the NAACP leadership that they didn't have racist policies like the Mormons. To NAACP Executive Secretary Roy Wilkins, the RLDS First Presidency bluntly wrote, "There is no need to bother you with the details of our history and how our churches are different at this time, but we assure you that we do not practice racial discrimination and have not done so at any time." This wasn't the first time that the RLDS leadership had tried to one-up the Mormons. In 1962, when Mormon Governor George Romney was contemplating a run for the presidency and had been taking heat from journalists for his church's exclusionary racial policies, Saints Herald editor Roger Yarrington published an editorial stating that the reorganized church has ordained Negroes to the priesthood, mischievously playing up the fact that his church was racially inclusive, while Romney's was not. And that editorial was published in dozens of newspapers in the United States. That might have been true in terms of official church policy, but it wasn't always true in practice, although the reorganized church had ordained black men to the priesthood since the days of founding prophet Joseph Smith III. They had their fair share of members who held strong anti-black views. William T. Blue, a respected African-American RLDS pastor in Florida, complained that the church wasn't doing enough to combat racism, both in the largest society and in the RLDS church. It appears to me, he wrote, that the church has shown a reluctance to face this problem, especially on the local, congregational, and district level. Nor were RLDS members progressive in how they read Scripture. A fair number of RLDS members, like their Mormon cousins, had racialized black people by associating their skin with a divine curse. Nevertheless, even as the RLDS and LDS First Presidency struggled to embrace the civil rights movement, another pivotal moment occurred that forced both traditions to reconsider their moderate position on civil rights. In April of 1968, a deranged man assassinated Dr. King, and during that critical month, hundreds of protests erupted across the nation, culminating in violence. King's death prompted the RLDS First Presidency to break their silence and grapple with his legacy. Whereas only 5 years earlier they had counseled Bill Russell and Paul Wellington to avoid controversial subjects like King, now they went on record to praise his commitment to racial equality, seemingly unconcerned about how their ultra-conservative members might interpret their support for the fallen leader. The resolution that the RLDS First Presidency passed at the April 1968 World Conference was pointed and effective. It praised King for his achievements in civil rights and called him a great American and world leader. In contrast, although the LDS First Presidency also worried about the tumult caused by King's assassination, they refused to produce a statement honoring his life or recognizing his commitment to racial equality. 2 days after King's murder, Apostle Benson circulated a scurrilous memo to all the general authorities, branding the slain leader a communist and urging his colleagues not to celebrate his life or acknowledge his death at the April General Conference. An angry Hugh B. Brown, however, who had always fought extremism with a relentless ferocity and a missionary-like zeal, ignored Benson's wishes and read a short statement at the April 1968 conference honoring King's life. President McKay wrote in his diary, he said, that Brown did this on his own accord. I like that statement. Brown didn't adorn his statement in superlatives like the RLDS First Presidency, but it's not because he rejected their assessment of King's accomplishments or importance. Brown didn't want to offend President McKay, who typically shunned making controversial statements in General Conference. The best that King could do then was to express sympathy at King's passing while acknowledging that he dedicated his life to what he believed to be the welfare of his own people. In conclusion, as we reflect on how the RLDS and LDS traditions responded to the civil rights movement, two insights readily emerge. The first is that both churches remained silent on civil rights until external pressure forced them to take moderate positions. The second is that King's death forced both churches to grapple with the complexities of the civil rights movement in a way they had never thought possible. While the RLDS Church acknowledged King's life and mission when he died, the LDS Church remained silent except for Hugh B. Brown's brief remarks at the LDS Church's April 1968 conference. Still, King's death affected the LDS Church in ways that might not be readily obvious. After King's murder in 1968, the LDS First Presidency silenced Apostle Benson and took drastic measures to curb right-wing extremism in the church, recognizing that equating racial equality with communism could harden the church's missionary efforts in black African nations. They also prohibited Benson from speaking at John Birch Society events, endorsing their message in his sermons, or allowing Birch speakers to speak in LDS church meeting houses. Furthermore, as both restoration traditions experienced bumps and bruises during the civil rights movement, the criticism they received, both from their own members and from outsiders, forced them to reflect on what racial equality meant and how it could be applied to what Dr. King called progressive action. In the half-century following King's death, RLDS leaders have engaged in a number of initiatives to support racial equality, as well as to denounce racism. The LDS Church has also taken a vocal role in combating racism and supporting racial initiatives, most recently in establishing a partnership with the NAACP to address issues of racism, poverty, and education in black communities. These progressive stances, however, are only of recent vintage. Both faith traditions struggled, to borrow Bill Russell's prescient words, with their priestly and prophetic roles. Both responded to the civil rights movement with caution, adopting a priestly or pragmatic approach to avoid offending their ultra-conservative members. But in the 21st century, as both the RLDS, and of course now Community of Christ, and LDS churches have expanded their evangelizing efforts in black African nations, both traditions have transitioned to a prophetic role in that they have taken measures to support specific civil rights initiatives. Here they have drawn on sacred scripture to bolster their cause by quoting and constantly repeating in promotional literature and in lesson manuals and in sermons a passage of scripture in the Book of Mormon where it states that all are alike unto God, black and white, male and female, Jew and Gentile. This might be the first time that either restoration tradition has aligned scripture with public policy aims and initiatives on matters of race and racial equality. If this is true, then we need more of it. In our chaotic world today, when black and brown people are under a constant assault from right-wing extremists, we need more prophetic messages like this to remind us of our universal brotherhood and sisterhood. Thank you.
Well, this time we encourage you to raise your hand and ask some questions, and please stand and address the person you'd like to answer that question. If you would remember to rephrase the question for those at home.
Very much appreciate both papers and the gists and conclusions. One thing I did wonder, though, was I noticed many times you spoke of right-wing extremism, ultra-right. Do you have a concept distinction in the period between conservative and ultra-conservative, or extremism, or simply conservatism? Is it simply extremism in itself, in your view?
I guess I open myself up for questions like this when I get a paper like this, right? Right, but it's a great question, and I'm glad you asked, because I think there is an important distinction to be made, right?
Will you rephrase?
So thank you. The question is distinguish between ultra-conservative or conservative views, or maybe ultra-right or something. And I didn't do that, in my paper in a short time. But we frequently get asked, 2020 election deniers, they're just conservative. They're not conservatives. There are plenty of conservative people who do not deny that the election of 2020 was stolen, right? That's a radical view. It really is a radical view. And so I think it's important to acknowledge what a conservative position is, whether it's a free market or a social conservative on abortion or gay rights or whatever, versus somebody who adopts an extremist position. And I want to be very quick on this, but in the 1960s, it's an extremist position to believe that Dr. King is a communist, that Dwight Eisenhower is a communist. That's not a conservative position, that's an extremist position. And I can give you one example. If I were to ask anybody of this age who might remember politics from the 1960s, who's Mr. Conservative in the 64 election, you might say Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, right? Barry Goldwater rejected civil rights, but it's not because he thought Dr. King was a communist. And I'll say one other thing to that, is that Ezra Taft Benson thought King was a communist. And that's an extremist position that even his own fellow brethren in the leadership of the church do not share.
So you would say that embracing conspiracy theories?
That's a huge part of it, absolutely. Absolutely.
In 1968, I was a student at Hastings Law School in San Francisco. The first guest speaker at that law school was Eldridge Cleaver, who came in with Bobby Seals on one side and Bobby Brown on the other side, dressed in military outfits, carrying guns. This was not the devotionals that I was, as a BYU student, was intended to be. Every other word was a four-letter word. They received standing ovations from this law school class at Hastings. 3 of those went on to be Supreme Court justices in California. When did Eldridge Cleaver leave the Black Panthers? Question number 1. And on your case, will the Restoration churches ever get away from just the accusation of being racist? Volleyball players, South Carolina basketball coaches, are we always going to be guilty and have to prove our innocence?
Well, two questions that we could spend a lot of time talking about. Eldridge Cleaver, I guess he was really very much throughout his entire career, even after he became a born-again Christian and converted to Mormonism, he enjoyed skewing the establishment. And I guess part of the way of skewing the establishment was using provocative language, like you say, four-letter words and whatever. And the stunt that they pulled, that the Black Panthers pulled in 1967, when they marched on the state capitol in Sacramento armed with rifles, walked into the legislative chambers, and that it was another example of kind of trying to shake up the establishment, and that was kind of a common motive, particularly of left-wing groups during the 1960s, was going after the establishment. To answer your first question, but he enjoyed doing that even later on. I mean, when he reverted, especially when he reverted back. I mean, in a way, he was skewing the establishment when he was, going on with his extreme conspiratorial views that he had embraced from Cleon, Skousen, and others. In a way, he always prided himself on being an agent provocateur, and I see that as a constant, consistent part of his behavior. Now, your second question is a much more difficult one to deal with, and I'll say my short bit, and I'm sure that Matt probably wants to say a lot more, because he's been engaged. Both of us have done a lot on the problematic issue of race within the LDS Church, and I think as long as the LDS Church embraces, and I'm speaking of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as long as they continue to embrace the writings of Joseph Smith, the scriptures of Joseph Smith, as part of their canon, they're always going to find themselves subject to the charge of racism, no matter what they do to kind of temper down, what's in the Book of Mormon about dark and loathsome or black and loathsome, and even the doctrines that are discussed in the Book of Abraham, which again is considered as canon. That's always going to be a problematic issue, I think, for the LDS Church. I'm sure that Matt has more to say on that.
So the question is, will the Restoration churches always struggle with the albatross of racism? And probably so, unfortunately. But I will say that both traditions have done remarkable things in recent years to sort of atone for the past a little bit. And I'm thinking of a guy named Jamar Tilsby is his name. He's an African-American religious theologian. And he claims that the way to overcome racism is to build relationships with people that you were previously racist towards. And I've seen that happen with the LDS and RLDS traditions, Community of Christ now, of course. And not just by forming relationships, but giving their time and their money. And that's the best that probably most can do in many respects, is to give your time and your money and to really show that you care about poverty and you care about structural inequities. And I'm sure there's a number of people in this room who may think that, myself included, that there's more to be done. Both traditions can do more, and that's certainly true of anything. But I do think it's worth recognizing what's praiseworthy and what both traditions are doing. And the LDS Church, for example, has spent a lot of time and money recently working with the NAACP. And I think that's important to note, because in the 60s, one of their senior apostles was calling the NAACP a communist front group. So, come a long way.
But most of that is done silently. I think the accusations are public. They go on ESPN, they go on every newscast in the last 2 weeks have covered that. And that's what the public sees, and that's what the media covers.
Yeah, well said. Sometimes it's not publicized nationally that both traditions are doing yeoman's work with civil rights groups.
The
comment with Matt and his comment about Scripture and the Scripture he quoted from the Book of Mormon. Most of us are not real literate with the Old Testament, but the first mixed racial marriage was the great prophet Moses, who married a black. One of the Ethiopians actually was the term in Hebrew, and she was black, had children with her, and when she was brought back to the camp there in the wilderness, his sister Miriam and Aaron and all of them complained, as well as others, and he said, "Get over it. Get over it. That's the way it is." And they eventually were made part of the group, part of the Israelites. There were others there anyway. There were Egyptians as part of that group as well. But as we see now with some of the Jews coming back to Israel, a lot of them have come from Ethiopia, and those were probably descendants of Moses' family. So that was the first, at least in the Scriptures, and I think it looks to the fact that one of the greatest prophets in the Old Testament was married to an Ethiopian.
So you mentioned a lot of the background concerning opposition or suspicion or acceptance of civil rights for both traditions in the 60s. And you mentioned what President Russell Nelson is doing in his tenure as prophet for Jesus Christ in Utah. But what can you tell us about, say, what happened in the late 1990s leading up to now that has helped us to get to this point in such an openness towards supporting civil rights and ethnic minorities within the tradition?
Rephrase that a bit.
Yeah, so the question is that LDS Church President Russell Nelson didn't work with the NAACP recently in a vacuum. There's a little bit of a history and a prologue. And the prologue is in the late 1990s when his church predecessor, a guy named Gordon B. Hinckley, accepted an invitation to speak to the NAACP's National Convention in April of 1998. And this is 4 years after his predecessor, Ezra Taft Benson, had passed. And so that clearly is a watershed moment, because President Hinckley is now sending an olive branch to the black community that we're not going to do business as usual with civil rights organizations. And so when that happened, I interviewed the NAACP leader who arranged for President Hinckley to speak. And I said, how did you feel when he accepted? She said, I was doing cartwheels. And so they were well aware of how they'd been demonized by I shouldn't say senior Mormon church leadership. It's really one apostle who believes this. There's no other evidence that any of the other Mormon apostles in the 60s thought King was a communist and all of that stuff. So anyway, they were thrilled about it because they recognized what it meant. And I think if Russell M. Nelson was in the room today, he would recognize that his work with the NAACP today would not have been possible without his predecessor blazing the trail. And I think that not just with our black brothers and sisters, but other communities of color as well.
Follow up on that. Didn't the LDS Church in Salt Lake, didn't they hire a public relations firm, and the public relations firm arranged that where President Hinckley actually approached them to speak?
No.
They approached him?
No, NAACP approached him. Because the NAACP, keep in mind the date, 1998, Martin Luther King federal holiday is still a rare issue, and our brothers and sisters in Utah are digging their heels in. We're one of the last states in Utah to support the federal holiday. And Janetta Williams is her name. She's the NAACP leader. She's part of the local chapter in Salt Lake. And she recognizes that unless you get the most vigorous and important lobbying arm in the state to support this holiday, it's not going to happen. So that's what's motivating it. And so what happened was she called President Hinckley's office, and he didn't get back to her, but he had his counselor, a guy named James Faust. So Jim Faust called her and said that we're going to, President Hinckley will speak and he'll be in touch with your office. That's the first thing that Faust said. And the second thing he said was that we're going to support, the church is going to support the MLK federal holiday, but we're going to do it subtly. We're going to tell our KSL outlets, our radio stations, we're going to start doing pro-king stuff. So they're not going to announce it in general conference. We're going to do this. They just started to do it subtly. And there's probably wisdom in that, right? Especially if you have people that think Dr. King's a communist. And so that's how it happened. And so almost overnight, those two things happened together. President Hinckley speaking at the NAACP, and also just a year and a half later, the state of Utah supported the MLK federal holiday. So those two things together were not coincidental. The church is trying to move away from right-wing extremism.
Just another question, kind of to follow up on his previous question. I've heard a rumor that the LDS Church was involved with the slave museum, with funding the slave museum in South Carolina, but they don't want publicity for that, and so I don't know if that's true or not. Why do you think, especially with the accusations with the Duke volleyball player and that sort of things, why do you think the church downplays some of these civil rights beneficiaries and doesn't want to publicize them, especially in light of kind of the public accusations? Matt. And Newell too.
I don't know about if the church funded the African American Civil Rights Museum. I find it, it's believable, it's plausible if they did, but I would find it implausible if it's not publicized in the church magazines, because the church is talked about these things in the past, what they're doing. And I don't know if it's so much to do this, it's just this is what we're doing, this is a good cause we want to support. So I don't think I'm persuaded by the idea that they would keep it quiet. And again, not just I think it's just maybe they just didn't do it, maybe they were never approached. The Duke volleyball thing, some of you may not know, but BYU volleyball, the women's team was playing Duke last week. It's been in the news. Anyway, there was an athlete from Duke, African American player, who claimed that she heard the N-word when she was serving. And so obviously that's a huge issue because the match kept going, and yet the officials were called, it was just called out during the match. Anyway, in subsequent days, they couldn't find out who the person was that had said it. And I've had people tell me this week that BYU is just sweeping this under the rug, and because they haven't found anybody yet. I thought, they have no reason to sweep this under the rug, right? They wouldn't do this. This is a debacle, a PR debacle for BYU. They want to find the person and take the appropriate action against him or her. But they haven't been able to do it, and I don't know why. But I will just say that I know BYU is very sensitive to, as is the Mormon Church, the LDS Church, about rooting out racism and worrying about racist things. And so there's nothing to be gained from letting this slide under the rug, and everything to lose, actually.
That's actually incorrect.
Yeah.
That person was identified by the player, and they ran an investigation, and nobody who knew this person who was identified by the player said that any of this ever happened. They did a very thorough investigation.
I just read BYU's report and a few other reports day before yesterday, so maybe if there's some recent news, I'm not aware of it. But the person they thought had did it, turns out they didn't do it. They had the camera, he wasn't even looking at the court at the time when the person was serving. That's what they concluded.
Identified by the player.
Yeah, but he wasn't, well, anyway, they interviewed him, so anyway.
But the person wasn't a BYU athlete, it was somebody in the stands.
Yeah, it was the person they thought had done it was a Utah Valley University student. But again, they recanted that because the evidence didn't determine that he was the one who did it. So I don't know.
I can't stand out, but how much effort do you put in to finding out the truth? How much time both of you spend finding the facts versus fiction?
You take that one.
Last question. You've asked a basic historiographical problematic question. You cut right to the chase, didn't you? But I mean that's always the very difficult thing about doing historical research, is finding what you would say the truth. What is the truth? I mean, you try to go to the sources that are the closest to the event that you're trying to find information about, because that'll get you closest to what actually happened in that event. And that's always the dilemma in researching particularly difficult, controversial topics, or even recent topics, is getting at what actually occurred, and that's always the dilemma of doing historical research. Like in doing my research on the relationship between Cleaver and Skousen, one source that I haven't been able to get at to find out, getting close to Skousen is Skousen's papers, because they're under restriction. They're under a time seal at Brigham Young University, and so in doing my research about their relationship, I was relying on what Cleaver had to say. I had to rely on oral interviews with people that interacted and knew both of those people. And so I can't claim that it was the absolute truth, but it was as close to the truth as I was able to get. And I think it's a dilemma for any historian. You want to add to that, Matt? And any more questions?
We better wrap.
One more?
One more.
One more, okay.
Time's up, so.
Okay, just quick.
Real quick, so I grew up down the street from Cleon, Skousen. And it was a surprise for me when I got into history and saw what a firebrand he was, because I knew him as just a kindly old man.
That was his demeanor.
But one thing I wanted to say, the last time I heard him speak, shortly before his death, he got up at a fast and testimony meeting in our ward, and got up and spent the whole time blasting President Bush for not doing enough for the black community following Hurricane Katrina. And so I was wondering, is that just a total aberration, or did he actually mellow over time?
Well, you bring up an interesting point, because that was something that I was completely unaware of. As I say, I felt that the research that I was able to do on Cleon Skousen, which was available, I confessed right up front that it was in many ways very superficial. So you have indicated a fact that I was unaware of, and I appreciate that insight. I ought to take you aside and interview you. And one more source right there. Thank you.
Thank you.